For the most part, horror movies are usually dirt cheap, easy to throw together, and do well regardless of whether or not they have an A-list cast. And because of this, it's no surprise that the genre turns out a plethora of sequels. Audiences at this point expect this, and as a result, a lot of horror sequels actually just kind of get a pass. Sure, they might not be as good as the original, but it's tough to get too annoyed by them. That said, there are still some sequels that don't just leave you feeling a little bit disappointed, but actually enraged to the point that they feel like an insult to the original. With that in mind, I'm Josh from What Culture Horror, and these are 10 horror movie sequels that pissed everyone off. Number 10, Brams the Boy 2. The original Boy movie centers around a nanny called Greta who's hired to take care of a boy called Brams. Upon arriving at the house though, Greta discovers that Brams is actually a porcelain doll, which the parents use to cope with the death of their son from decades ago. Spooky shenanigans ensue as it appears that this freaky looking toy is moving around on its own. The audience is then led to believe that this is just going to be your regular possessed doll movie, but then in the climax we learn that the real Brams, decidedly still human and not a possessed doll, has actually been living in the house's walls for years and has been moving the doll around just for a bit of crack. It was a cool twist, but this revelation is actually ignored in Brams the Boy 2, since the doll here is retconned as having actually been a supernatural being this whole time. For some inexplicable reason, the doll now has organs and can move around by itself. Even though it's implied that Brams survived the events at the end of The Boy, there's also no mention of him this time around. Not only does this plot development contradict the premise of the previous entry, but it also makes this sequel feel like the shameless rip-off of Child's Play and Annabelle that everyone groaned that the first movie was. Number 9, Sinister II. The first Sinister, without question, absolutely slapped, to the point where people are probably sick of hearing people, especially us here at What Culture Horror, banging on about how good it was. But it does bear repeating. The Scott Derrickson helmed and Ethan Hawke starring horror was packed with scares and established a world that was ripe to mine with future sequels. And of course, after its success, the first of those envisioned sequels arrived rather quickly with a new director at the helm. Now, this is by far not the worst movie on this list, and in fact, you can tell that the original writers did return for this one. As a result, there are some cool deaths, one in particular involving rats, and some neat ideas tucked in there, but overall, it definitely lacks the charm and personality of that original. The way it's shot and put together is just so limp, with no real drive or dynamism that's needed to sell this story. As a result, the movie effectively killed the franchise as everyone just kind of went, that sucked, and then forgot all about Bagul and his weird video tips. Number 8, Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2. The Blair Witch Project may have received mixed reviews upon its initial release, but no one can contest just how influential it has become by absolutely smashing the box office at the time and helping popularize found footage horror and the very idea of viral marketing. Because of the Blair Witch Project's unprecedented success, the studio was always going to cash in with a sequel. And even though everyone connected with the first film wanted more time to work on a script, the studio shoved out the follow-up Book of Shadows only 1 year later. Sadly, this film has nothing in common with the original save for the title. First off, there's no found footage this time around. Secondly, the scares are completely different. And thirdly, there's not even a Book of Shadows in it. Now, the aesthetic changes might have worked had the studio allowed the director to deliver their vision of a meta sequel, where the original movie was actually just a movie in this story. However, it was cut to pieces in the editing room and hacked into something that pleased nobody.
Number 7, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday.
As the Friday the 13th franchise continued to decline in quality, the studio reps decided to kill off Jason Voorhees for good in the supposed final installment, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Because the previous entry, Jason Takes Manhattan, was pretty god-awful, no one was really expecting anything from this finale.
Still, Jason Goes to Hell has a surprisingly strong opening. In the beginning, we see the hockey mask-wearing, machete-wielding killer chasing a damsel in distress. Just as he's about to hack her to pieces though, the woman reveals herself to be an FBI agent who's actually led Jason into an ambush, allowing her squad to then blow him up to kingdom come. Although the film sucks you in straight away, viewers may wonder where the story can possibly go since Jason popped his clogs in the very first scene. And sadly, that's where the whole movie falls apart.
After his body is transported to the morgue, it's then revealed that Jason is actually a demon slug. After bursting out of Jason's heart, this sliming entity body hops into unsuspecting victims and uses their body bodies to continue his killing streak. Fans were understandably furious, not only because of this ridiculous revelation, but also the fact that Jason was only in the movie for 5 minutes. Number 6. American Psycho 2. American Psycho 2 centers around a criminology student called Rachel who was traumatized after a serial killer called Patrick Bateman, you may have heard of him, you know, slick looks, good business card, totally insane, murdered her babysitter. Desperate to become an FBI agent, Rachel joins a government program and kills anyone that might jeopardize her chances of earning the position. American Psycho 2 is the worst kind of follow-up though, since it feels utterly disconnected from its predecessor. The first entry was a satire which dissected consumerism, classism, and materialism. This film, on the other hand, is just a generic slasher. Apart from a handful of references to Bateman himself, you wouldn't even know that this was a sequel to American Psycho. And that's because, well, it isn't really. American Psycho 2 originally had no affiliation with the first film, and 90% of this movie was completed before the producers foolishly decided to turn it into a follow-up. Just to add insult to injury as well, the film absolutely ruins the character of Patrick Bateman by confirming that he was a cold-blooded murderer, while the previous movie heavily implied he fabricated his serial killer persona or just got away with it. Not only did the original author Bret Easton Ellis denounce this sequel, but the lead star, Mila Kunis, called it an utter embarrassment to her career. Number 5. Orman 4: The Awakening. Orman 3, The Final Conflict, follows the Antichrist Damien Thorn as he prepares to initiate Armageddon. Even though Sam Neill is excellent at portraying a grown-up Damien with a calm menace, this threequel is let down by a weak script and a lack of genuine scares. The Final Conflict may have been a disappointment, but at least it wrapped up all of the loose ends as it concluded with Damien himself being defeated and the apocalypse finally being averted. But 10 years later, the franchise decided to spurt out a follow-up called Orman 4: The Awakening, which centers around Damien's daughter, Delia. Because this is the first film in the franchise to focus on a character besides Damien, you might think that it would try to go in a bold new direction. Instead, though, it just rehashes every plot point from the original so blatantly, it's practically a soft remake. Throw in last-minute twists that render entire characters pointless, and the whole thing just plays out like a huge waste of time.
Number 4. Darko.
So now I guess we get to the question of, is Donnie Darko a horror film? The cult hit is such an enigma that, yeah, it kind of fits into a bunch of different genres, but I've always saw it as a sort of proto-elevated horror movie, full of disturbing imagery, existential themes, and of course, a time-traveling bunny rabbit prophesizing the end of the world. The unwanted sequel, Darko, pushed those horror themes further, but in a way that simply turned it into an embarrassing mess. One of those sequels that was just made despite nobody thinking it was a good idea. Darko limped out to the straight-to-DVD market in 2009, chronicling a story that follows Donnie's sister as she finds herself dealing with a lot of the same baggage that haunted her now-dead by falling jet engine brother. The end result absolutely blows, neither working as a compelling story in its own right while also crapping all over the legacy of the original movie. It was one of those everyone hated before they even saw it, but the final film itself did nothing to convince them that they were wrong. If you're a fan of the original, honestly, even if you don't trust me on anything else, please trust me on this, just don't bother. Number 3, The Descent Part 2. The Descent is a bona fide classic about a group of friends who decide to go on a spelunking vacation only to get lost in the cave and realize they are being hunted by inhumane savages called crawlers. With this simple premise, the flick was amongst the most effective horror movies of the millennium. It's straight to the point and, like the best monster flicks, uses the creatures sparingly. After making nearly 20 times its budget though, it was no surprise when the studio eventually greenlit a sequel. However, everything that made the original special is absent from The Descent Part 2. Instead of making the horror claustrophobic, the follow-up focuses too much on splatter gore. On top of that, the crawlers themselves appear far too often, robbing these devious imps of their mystique. They look like cheap rubber costumes to boot in some scenes as well, which definitely doesn't help anything. Also, British viewers were left more disappointed by The Descent Part 2 since the UK version of the first movie concluded with hero Sarah never actually escaping from the cave, implying that she was eventually killed by the crawlers. As a result, it becomes a little bit confusing to see Sarah alive and well in the sequel. Number 2, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. With the success of 2018's Halloween, it wasn't surprising when the Texas Chainsaw Massacre attempted to reinvigorate itself in a similar manner. The issue is, it had already tried this gimmick once before with 2013's Texas Chainsaw.
And by similar, I mean identical, since both revitalizations center around the original survivor going head-to-head with the masked serial killer who hounded them decades ago.
And full spoilers now for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you've been warned. This decision could be forgiven somewhat if the movie did justice to the heroine of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Sally Hardesty. Sadly, the filmmakers couldn't even get that right. Although the actress playing Sally does a serviceable job, the character's late introduction and then sudden death makes her appearance feel tacked on and a little bit desperate. Now look, I know I've ragged on this movie before and I won't keep going in on it in every single video, but it does have some cool ideas in there, I'll give it that. The bus scene is cool, there are some inventive shots and it's brutal as anything. But when the story is this mind-numbing and the writing this bad, you might as well just watch those good bits on YouTube or something. Number 1, The Exorcist II: The Heretic. Because The Exorcist was the most successful horror film ever upon its initial release, it seemed inevitable that the studio would make a sequel.
Even though the original cast members, Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn, were against the idea, they were eventually negged into appearing in The Exorcist II: The Heretic. But this sequel isn't just bad, it's incomprehensible. It delves into parapsychology, mythology, brainwave synchronizers, and other nebulous concepts which leaves the viewer utterly befuddled and wondering where all the scares are. The original film left viewers rattled and unsettled for days, but upon watching this trash heap, you won't be frightened. Instead, you'll be asking questions like, why is James Earl Jones spitting tomatoes and screaming like a tiger while dressed as a grasshopper? Seriously, the mind boggles.
Now, a lot of sequels that try to do something different are often wrongly hated just because they're different, in my opinion anyway. I mean, look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 or Nightmare on Elm Street 2 for examples of this. But Exorcist II: The Heretic? Nah, this just sucks.